our first speaker today is a very special lady from Ireland. She's an immunologist, a wide-renowned expert, if I get this right, high-throughput proteomics. Right? Good. And automation of high-content protein arrays. Isn't that just the sort of person we want around during a pandemic? But she's basically been censored. She was also a government advisor. And until recently, she was very vocal about the lockdowns and medical interventions and suffered because of that. So she's now a leader in the forefront of this movement and is working very hard to defend our inalienable rights and freedoms. Ladies and gentlemen, give it up to Professor Dolores Carhill.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So thank you to the organizers, and thank you for you guys for coming. I'm very honored. And if you hadn't watched my videos in 2020, I wouldn't be here and my message wouldn't have got out. So thank you very much. So I'm going to speak fairly quickly today, and I'm going to give you a whistle-stop tour of to answer a few questions. And first of all, just very briefly, for those of you, I know most of you know where I am, but I just have a couple of slides because this is recorded. And just to say why you haven't heard from me since 2021 is that I'm completely censored. And there is an algorithm on Facebook and various platforms within 6 seconds that any new video of me is automatically taken off. So I've been working very hard in the background and networking with lots of people. So just because I think people think that I've disappeared, but I've been working full time and voluntary on all this. Yeah, so I haven't disappeared. Yes. So okay, go. So now I've only just put this slide up because for those of you who don't know, I'm going to give a few slides, but just that I basically realized, as some of you may know, what was going on from my family history and the history of Ireland all through my childhood. And my family were involved in supporting a farmer who won in the Supreme Court in Ireland in 1988, a precedence case of a farmer related, John Hanrahan, related to his inalienable right and the ability to live healthily on his farm after a pharmaceutical industry put up an incinerator and all of his animals and all of his pets died. And on our farm, all of our calves were born dead, which had never happened, some of them with 2 heads. But from that was when I was, before I was 10 years old, and then he and we lost the cases all through my childhood, and essentially we couldn't find a market for our milk and our beef, so we were impoverished in a way. And then the Supreme Court case was won in 1988, having lost all of the other cases. So basically with my family, I learned the legal system and the law and inalienable rights and Brehon law all through my childhood. So I then essentially dedicated my life in a way, because my grandmother asked me when I was 7 if I would also support the sovereignty of Ireland, and part of she asked me was to help reunite the 4 nations of England, Ireland, Scotland and Wales, which I accepted. And then I really planned my career in order to prepare for 2020. So I just wanted to highlight that I did run a class 4 lab, a class 3 lab. I qualified to run a class 4 lab. And I gave evidence after 9/11 in Congress, and then was in the unit for the global coordination of the world, which is just, and that unit in the European Commission is how do you recover failed states or nations after things like war. And in a way, that's kind of what we're doing now. But I just put that slide up to let you know that really I've been studying this for all my life, which is 21 years, right? And then most of you will remember about Trafalgar Square, which I'm going to mention, and many of you were there. But partly what you'll see, what I was doing then was, and I also knew because we've studied sabotage and infiltration in Northern Ireland, and I professionally studied the psychology of sabotage and infiltration. And when I was a 15-year-old, before many of you were born, I actually travelled and interrailed on my own and then went behind the Iron Curtain to study the psychology. So there, people were so frightened they wouldn't even look at you. Yeah, whereas, of course, in Tipperary and in England, back at that time, everybody talked to each other. So it was very interesting. But also, and you know, some of the best supporters of me have been the veterans. And the veterans came to protect us in Trafalgar Square, as many of you remember. And also many people who were former prisoners, and many of them had been actually put in prison because they were trying to expose corruption. And so part of what we have to do is to realize that we really, as four nations, have to come together. And we've been working with the people like Mick Stott, and I was involved in the beginning with Guardians 300, which many of you, I see, allegedly Dave and everybody here, right? So that's about to exercise your inalienable rights. But what I was doing in Trafalgar Square was having standing in law, so that if they decided to come after me with summonses into their system, it would be to defend your inalienable rights, but one of your most inalienable rights is to return home. So it was an honour to be involved in Trafalgar Square in the early rallies and then to travel home. And as you know, and also in Scotland, if anyone remembers that amazing day in Scotland, they issued warrants on both sides in England and Ireland for my organising Trafalgar Square and travelling home. And the one in Trafalgar Square was up to 10,000 fine and 10 years in prison as a criminal offence for organising a meeting of more than 30 people outside in the summer. And I have 9, I think, summonses or invitations into their system, criminal offences, 6 months each in prison. And there are 2 live bench warrants currently, you know. So basically, this is an ongoing issue. And if anybody knows, which of course I'm very happy, because in a way I have standing, right? So that what you need in law to defend your rights for COVID-19 or monkeypox 2025 is, it's all the same thing. It's an infringement of your inalienable rights to speak, to hear, and my right to hear, and to assemble and to travel. So they're your inalienable rights. And as you'll see in the law, one man or woman's rights, if we're successful, defends everybody's rights. So you just need one example. So it was actually fortunate in a way that we had that, you know, they issued warrants because they're inviting. Okay, so this is Slievenamon, the valley I grew up. This is the precedence case. I'm just going to go through 1988 in the Supreme Court, the famous John Hanrahan case, which defended our inalienable rights. And what was interesting, we lived in a valley of about 200 families, but only really about 5 families helped John Hanrahan through those 15 years. Many of the other families denied that it was happening or also buried their animals, because companies like Avonmore said that if you supported John Hanrahan and went public, they wouldn't take your milk. So you'd be bankrupted. So we also saw in the 80s where the farmers who stood up didn't have any money, and then the banks moved in to take their farms. And then my father was involved, as many other people, in ensuring that the banks didn't take their farms by us standing together. So the farms would go to the auctions and not bid, or bid very low amounts. And it worked. Yeah, and then of course we, in our childhood, and my father got a lot of hassle from the people dressed as police and revenue and the journalists and the politicians and everybody pretending it wasn't going on. It wasn't just my father, but anyone who stood up. So that all happened really while I was still a teenager. And it's very similar to what's going on now. So I know people, so basically I knew what the reaction would be to me, and I read the manuals on sabotage and infiltration and what they do to infiltrators, and it's a process in psychology called othering. So you make a label like far right or anti-vaxxer or conspiracy theorist, and then you propagandize that for a few decades before, and then a lot of people, maybe 2/3 of people, are prone to that kind of psychological manipulation, and then they, when those labels are repeated a short number of times, they then cannot hear anything you say, and that's an effective mechanism of silencing people. So in a way, I know people know what happened to me, but I knew what was going to happen to me, and I did it in a very aware way. So it's not as difficult as someone, like other people that have been speaking out, that they weren't prepared for it. So then what I decided to do was invent a technology that would undermine one of the pillars. That's interesting, it hasn't come up. Of their system. So I invented this co-invented with about 30 of my group in the Max-Planck-Institute. And what it basically, we were about 1 million times more sensitive than the diagnostic testing that was going on in the hospitals. And this was in the 1990s. And so how their system works is that many of the diagnostic tests are inaccurate. And so they were diagnosing people with diseases like autoimmune diseases and cancer that they didn't have. And then the treatments were giving them adverse events. And then they were giving them other medications for adverse events. So this is about 10 years ago, but this is the work that I was doing, was that this is a review that I had to pay for, even though I have 100 peer-reviewed articles, and I was on the Nobel Prize nominating committee for many years, and we were the top lab in the world for detecting inaccurate testing. And what I did for a lot of my career was, and I patented my technology, and then I donated it for free. And I got the German government to fund an institute with 40 technicians for 10 years. I gave all of my research for free to them, and anyone could order it for free. And what I was saying is, if I publish a paper, if anyone wants to challenge what I'm doing, they can just order my equivalent research and repeat my results. And if what I'm saying is not true. And I very quickly became on national and international advisory boards, because I was helping governments get more money from the research funding by getting them to focus on things like PhD students and actual useful applications, and setting up companies that would actually employ people, or people would spin out companies. So what I then did was, when I had exposed inaccurate testing, that I would then challenge the diagnostic and pharmaceutical industry, the governments and the regulators, to remove the fraudulent tests. And this was in the 90s and 2000s, because this is a review with the OECD. Have any of you heard that? That's one of the organizations that does sometimes very good analysis. And they had done a review and shown that the biggest cause, so in 2017, 2018, of deaths under 55 back then, was preventable adverse events and medical error. And it's the third leading cause of death in the world. So this was 2018. And that's even though it's completely underreported. Now, of course, it goes down like a lead balloon. If you're a professor and you're trying to expose fraud in the diagnostic industry and in hospitals and with your colleagues. But one of the reasons why I got many fraudulent tests removed from the market was that I knew the law myself, and I was able to challenge them, because fraud unravels all. Yeah, so I'm only mentioning that because later on we set up the World PCR Sequencing Consortium in America, and we managed to get the fraudulent COVID-19, at least the requirement in America, to not be there, because I'll describe that later on. But one of the things is, my area in medicine was law and medicine, right? So, of course, knowing my background, you can see why that would be an area that I would choose. So even though I was a professor of medicine, and one of the things in law is that, and in my companies and in my research, we did 20,000 people in clinical trials. And if you are a principal investigator of a clinical trial, you are liable in law if anybody is harmed on the trial. Yeah? So one of the things then is that what we have to do is to make sure that people are not harmed on clinical trials, because a lot of people volunteer on clinical trials because they think they are doing a real sacrifice, so that, drugs or treatments will be developed so that their children or their community will have better health systems. But in the law, if one man or woman, or we'll say say if you have 10,000 people on a trial, you can predict every week on average, in comparison to, we'll say, 55 million people in England, how many people would you expect to die randomly, right? That's kind of the background rate of natural death or car accidents. And then you would compare that to people on the clinical trial. And if there was, 5 or 10 people that died on the trial, a trial should be stopped immediately and worldwide, right? That's the law, because anyone who dies, and if there's a higher death rate, if they die for their family, it's a preventable death. And another name for preventable death is murder. Yeah. So the people who are accountable are the men and women who run the trial, the principal investigators, and the regulators in that country, and the coroner, and the police, and the attorney general, and the forensics. So the area that I was in was basically studying adverse events. And so when you do it and you realize it's the third biggest cause of death, it means that there are certain professions who are not doing their job. And they are the coroners and the police and the regulators and the people who do the analysis of adverse events. Okay, and maybe just to say the quick one is that, as people may know, my grandfather was born in 1884 and my grandmother in 1886, so they were 30 in 1916, 32, and they were involved, as many people were, in proclaiming Éire or Ireland as a sovereign nation successfully in law. Now that's quite important, because the establishment, we have a very deep tradition of law in Ireland for tens of thousands of years, but the trial by jury system was re-established in Ireland in that period, from the 2020s onwards. And what my parents and grandparents have seen is the undermining, in 3 generations, of a lawful, sovereign, accountable structure into what is a legal structure coming from the Crown and the City of London. And we were observing it, and our rural communities, kind of in real time. So really in Ireland, up until 1980, we had a lawful structure with accountable police and nurses, So if any of you are over maybe 30 or 40, you may remember how the hospital system worked before, and that you could go in and visit your loved ones anytime. Okay, so now this is just to move quickly into where we are. As you know, with many, many people, we've been volunteering. One of the key websites now, though, if you're interested in contacting me, because I am a little bit censored, is the one custodianinstitutemembers.com. And that's the one that's free to join. But what I'm going to do from July onwards is set up courses, with other people. And we've put a lot of work into websites that can't be taken down, and Moodle open source university structures. And the vision is that if you have courses on how to grow food, or how to grow potatoes, or how to set up communities or whatever, that will be a platform for you to just advertise your courses. But I'm also going to put up courses in order to educate people, because the way to unravel this, in one of, I think is that you understand the legal system and how the legal system is working. And then that as a group of 4 nations or whatever, we help each other to re-establish the lawful process, which is the trial by jury process. So the overall vision that we have is that, you are already in communities. And I guess the good news is that maybe all of this BS is already over for you, because if you know how to grow your food, and if you have a community, you are pretty much independent of the system. Yeah. So what we would like, or I would like people to do, and I'm very happy to work with people, is that people go from maybe having 1% of their food to, over a few years, try to get to 50% of your food. So that once you have your own food, you are essentially impregnable to things like the ATMs being switched off. So I met a guy who in 2017 wrote a script that all the ATMs in Europe can be switched off in one go. Now, I'm not trying to instill fear, but they can stop for a while, or they can move on. And the kind of levers they have are to lose the purchasing power, of whatever fiat money you have, or to turn off the ATM machines, or to pretend there's some issue that the internet goes down. But if you're food secure and you're involved in your community, then you're really independent of this. And then people who may not have listened to you in the past might actually start to listen to you. So food security and maybe foraging. Now, the more of us that get together, the less of a chance that they'll do that, right? It's kind of a chicken and egg. So this is, in a way, we are gaining a number of years for people to actually build the structures to hold them accountable. Okay, and then this is just the website, so custodianinstitutemembers.com, and it's free, and probably from September, October, I'll have my first courses, but I'm also making it available for anybody else to hold their courses. Okay, so then the main part of the talk then is just very quickly, I think a lot of the questions I get asked is what's going on, who's behind it, what are the solutions, how are the solutions implemented, and how do they work? Was that fair enough? So very quickly, and there's probably, so what's really going on? Now, what's really going on, in my opinion, is that it's just an undermining of the law, because the law works through an interaction between one man or woman, so like me in Trafalgar Square and somebody dressed up as police saying, I'm going to, instigate criminal proceedings against you. And then if you undermine that, that's how society breaks down. So the quick story I say is that people don't really think, how does society break down in a day? So if you have, for example, 12 people that are not very bright and they want to rob a bank, but they're not very bright, so they can't figure out all the safes and everything. So then they think, well, 6 of you go and dress up as police, order the uniforms from Amazon, right? Now, this is, if you were going to do something bad, this is like 5 minutes into your thinking process, right? If you're that way inclined. So then 12 people go, 6 of them are dressed up as police, and then 6 of them go in and rob the bank. And then a few minutes later, the other 6 dressed up as police go in and tell everybody, it's okay, we're the police. And then they take the 6 people and they all go off in 2 cars, plus the money, exactly, right? So I use this convoluted thing about men dressed up as police, and So the thing is, the biggest weapon we have is with our voices, right? Which is then, just because someone is dressed up as police doesn't make them police, right? So that is the solution, right? So if you are dressed up as police, and then I'll go into it later on, but the whole law is act in honor, do no harm, and that we, all of us, from the second we're conceived till our last breath, we have inalienable rights of life, travel, speech, privacy, and property, right? Now, anyone who's paid as police and judges, and this is the same in the whole world, right? It's the law, the natural law, but it's the same everywhere, that if you dress up as police or judges, your job is to ensure that people are not harmed and that people act in honor, which is essentially to investigate fraud, but they are paid to protect our inalienable rights of life, travel, speech, privacy, and property. And your right to life, so when I was lecturing about your right to life, which means that physicians or doctors or surgeons can't kill people because there's a maxim in law, no one is above the law, right? No one is above the law. And then you cannot kill people because they have a right to life. And part of your right to life, which is related to COVID-19, is that you must get full, free, and informed consent. Full, that means you have to be told the adverse events as well, honestly. Free means there has to be no element of coercion. And informed means that you have to understand it. And if anybody does anything to your body or tries to coerce you, that is actually one of the highest criminal offences because it's infringing on your right to bodily integrity. And that makes complete sense because if somebody was going to inject you with a poison, you have the right to say no. And powerful words in the law are trespass. It's a trespass on your body. And if you result in killing, if you are then given something that's more harm than good, the man or woman who gave you the injection is then liable for infringing on your right to life. And the men and women who should investigate that are police and coroners, forensic pathologists, and the system, we'll say, right, which should be overseen by trial by jury. So obviously that's not happening, right? So what's happening is we have people dressed up as police. So they are paid to defend our right to life, our freedom of travel, our freedom of speech, privacy and property. So what the system that's been around, to try and push this legal system on us, the COVID-19 thing and the PCR testing and the masks were really a test to see how far have they removed people from the knowledge of the law that they would actually accept that people would say you have to wear a mask or you can't travel for 5 miles. And then the strategy was, well, if 95% of the population do it willingly, that then they will just go and target the small number of people that were standing up. And that's why we were organising big rallies in the World Freedom Alliance and in England, as all of you were, so that if 1 million people turned up, then that would make it more difficult. But what people don't know is, really don't appreciate, is that the people who are paid as police constables in England are paid to defend our right to life, travel, speech, privacy and property. But then there's actually a criminal offence in England today. It's the second highest crime below treason, and it's called malfeasance, and it's reserved for men and women that dress up as police and judges and coroners and members of parliament who actually misrepresent the law by making one of your inalienable rights, for example, a criminal offence, like 10 years in prison. Yeah? Does that make sense? So therefore, and I'm going to go into why it is not working, right? And then it may take us a number of years to hold them accountable. And the solution is this trial by jury system. But to set up a trial by jury system, you need tens of thousands of people. And that partly what I'm proposing and what a lot of us are proposing is that we run the knowledge of the trial by jury through local co-op groups or PMA groups, so that if we educate 10, 20 people, you can go back to your community groups and educate tens of thousands of people and then maybe volunteer for a lawful trial by jury, which will then hold a precedence case like a coroner or whatever accountable. Does that make sense? So I think what has been going on, and we, don't need to go into it too much, but it's just that the solution is really this accountability mechanism. Now, while solutions like growing food and detoxing are all very important and developing homeschools, this is kind of a fundamental thing that we don't want this to happen again. And all societies that have crumbled over millennia are that there was some kind of element of coercion through food supply or through slavery or tyranny, so that they could enslave the majority of people and then strategically target the individual standing up. So part of the solution for us is to work together and then put the spotlight back on them, and we all then look strategically, potentially between the 4 nations, for example, coroners, or example, people paid as nurses or paid as police, that would be precedence examples. Yeah? Okay, and then this one, the next slide is who's behind it. So some people find these next 2 slides interesting if you want to take a photograph, because what I think is a lot of people can't move on until they are kind of have some understanding of who's behind it. Now, for anyone, these books, there is much more behind it. So what's going on has probably started 3,000 years ago. And definitely in the last 2,000 years and since Roman times. But these are kind of a good overview. And here's another one of just a few more. And there's a book there, Rosa Corey, from Behind the Green Mask. And she basically goes through that the so-called green agenda. She said when every time you see green, substitute death. And one of the things is, all the, focus on biodiversity. And in Ireland, we hardly have any insects. For a time when they're actually focusing on so-called biodiversity, that we have hardly any ladybirds, any birds or whatever because of the poisoning. So I think this is because there are some people that find it hard to figure out the enormity of what's going on. And I think it comes from that people are very good, that are naturally cannot imagine that a group of people would get together over many generations. And I think if that is your perspective, or if you have family members, the book, The Committee of 300, is actually very good because it's over 30 years old, and it just goes through the roles that in order to get to that role, you have to be self-selected by the group that's behind this. Does that make sense? Yeah. And then the other question is, what are the solutions? Now, one of the things is, as well, is does it work? Because I know a lot of people listening to me are actually very frustrated because it's still going on, right? So I'm going to give you, a thing about does it work? And then it won't really work that we stop what's going on until we have a mechanism in our nations to hold individuals accountable. Because a lot of the people, we're paying them and their pension. But if one coroner was held accountable for falsification of a death cert around the lines of fraud or that it is a criminal offence, then suddenly the coroners across the 4 nations wouldn't be as easily falsifying death certs for COVID-25 or monkeypox 26. Do you get it? Because they're actually cowards. So it's actually easier. And then one man or woman's rights defends everybody's rights. So if somebody comes with a precedence around a death cert, then we can start the process of holding them accountable. But it's also very important that every man and woman are innocent until proven guilty. So that what they want to do, their whole thing is exactly. So theirs is order out of chaos. But you probably know, but they need chaos in order to put in their more control. So what we have to do is not take the law into our own hands, but actually set up a mechanism that we can actually strategically take examples. Yeah. So that we can hold people accountable. So then and this is to acknowledge as well the work of people like Edward Fitzgerald, who I know spoke recently, and also people like Mick Stott. We've been working together, about 12 people, in trying to figure out how do we set up lawful community structures, in the Britain and Ireland and around the world. So what we have to do is just each of us are individuals, but figure out a way that we can work together in a way that works, and then that we take on maybe some of these projects. And what I'm going to do in the Custodian Institute is just educate people about auditing. So I've used the word audit because you're not giving advice, you're just auditing. So say if there was a man dressed in blue, then you can just ask questions like, what's your name? What is your role now? You're just auditing the situation. Or if your loved one was in hospital, you would audit what drugs that they've on. So it's just for people to get the skills, or if you were an auditor, that you could then audit the voting in your local area, or we could work together and we could audit how much poisons are in your tap water. Yeah. And then we can just do it together and become auditors. So, and then once you audit people and ask questions and know how to take a record, I'm thinking like 1-day courses to become an auditor. Like we did the Guardians 300, and that would be free. And then we would be auditing together then, like the fluoride in the water, or whether the 5G are actually harming or not. Do you get it? It's more, and then those people who audit may well be, and you can also audit your name and what that name is and how that name refers to the money in your bank account and your passport, and who actually owns the name and who owns the money. And once you learn how to audit your legal entity, and if you take ownership of that legal entity, then the assets behind the legal entity, like my legal entity is Dolores Cahill, and Josephine Dolores owns the legal entity Dolores Cahill, but then also owns the assets that are in the legal entity. So you can just audit your home and stuff, because I think it's a good skill to have, and you can learn it very easily. What do you think of that yeah? Okay, cool. Yes. And of course, to acknowledge as well, there are many other people doing the same thing, right? So part of the thing with Custodian Institute is that if people have courses, I'd prefer to put their courses up than my courses, right? You know what I mean? I'm not saying, so like we have allegedly Dave, and there's Sovereign Pete, and there's all kinds of courses, Guardians 300. So everything that I've been doing, including in the World Freedom Alliance, is we were an alliance of alliances to prevent duplication, And then the other thing, we're going to have a meeting in Ireland on the 21st and 22nd of September this year. And I'm hosting that with the Weekend Truth Festival people, with Kev and Nick. And we will then be presenting, we'll say, the auditing of courses, but also there'll be existing co-ops, farmers, health hubs, Mark Atwood will be there. So we're just trying to network with the people that are actually doing something, and everybody's invited so that we can make it easier. And I'm networking with the farmers in Ireland, and they seem to, when they see somebody doing a co-op and it works, they are more motivated. So a lot of people, when they don't see it actually working and they don't meet people that it actually works. So that's the overview of what we want to do next. So then the last thing is, how are the solutions implemented, right? So this is where you can be rightly critical of us, we'll say, up to now, for how we have whether we've been successful or not, right? Because it's not that easy. And I think partly why they're censoring us is that they want everybody to live in fear and think there's no solutions. And a lot of the things are a distraction. So I would say, even though it's terrible what's going on in the various wars, a lot of that is to distract us, And I would say things like pieces of paper, the World Health Organization pandemic treaty is a piece of paper, and kind of it instills fear in people, like when this piece of paper is passed, and they're not really giving you solutions. Yeah, and a piece of paper, if you have a trial by jury system, can be nullified very easily. So, but it takes a long time in a way to do this. And one of the things that we were working on was the co-ops again. Right. So this is, again, we have to acknowledge Edward Fitzgerald and Mick Stott and all the people involved in that. So the idea would be, and I don't know if anyone here has heard Edward's talk, we were trying to set up a mechanism that cooperatives would have the same paperwork around the world, and we'd all be networked, so that we could, if people were to travel in the future, you can then be, like if you were a scout organization, you can just turn up at a co-op in Norway or in Italy and we'd all know each other. Now, we had a little bit of difficulty with the UK co-op, if anyone has heard that. Anyway, we couldn't set them up in the way we wanted to. But this is then just to say that we want to implement the trial by jury system through the local hubs. Now, we ran with about 8 in Britain and about 2 or 3 in Ireland for the last year, just networking with people that actually had co-ops of hundreds of people and got feedback. But one of the things is we were trying to use the UK co-op paperwork, and to acknowledge as well that Chris Coverdale very generously gave us all of his information, and he had done the work on the multi-stakeholder organisation co-ops, which is very good, and he was very generous. But when we were working with the UK co-op, one of the articles of their paperwork was that in the event the co-op was wound up, that all the assets of the co-op would belong to UK Co-op, which is a private company. So that we felt that we couldn't put out that, well, I felt I couldn't put out that paperwork because people would think we were leading you down a road where somebody was going to steal all your assets. But we have a very good code of behaviour. And I think the way to do it now is to do a lawful co-op or just your standard PMA, the Private Members Association. And the man that was in the Weekend Truth Festival was very good at that. That has helped Mark Atwood. Peter Wilson. He has, what's his website? It's what is it? Return to Democracy. So he has very good paperwork. So I think that's very good paperwork, or also that you just draft your own. But the idea is that in some way that all of the PMAs or the lawful co-ops or even the legal co-ops that will work together, and that we'll actually decide to develop, or, I'm throwing it out there because in Ireland we are doing the trial by jury system and we are educating conveners, and we've actually held a trial by jury system, already, and no police turned up. So that's interesting. Yeah. We didn't know if they would turn up or not, but that's just to give you the website of UK Co-op. Now you can get there a lot of information about co-ops. So do people know what co-ops is? It's the old tradition that even if 2 or 3 farmers work together in a co-op, or you can have thousands of people in a co-op, and they have a lot of good information. It's just they have this one line that says, in the event the co-op is wound up. Now, why we were trying to modify their paperwork to include men and women and lawful enterprises as well as legal, is that in their system you can get a bank account. and it's not so easy to get a bank account, and people just want to start. So we wanted to be pragmatic, so that you could just say, well, here's the paperwork. But we do have a lot of information behind it, and we will make that available. Okay, so then how does it work? So the whole thing with the trial by jury then is, how does it work? And in a way, they are still offering the COVID-19 injection in Ireland, including to young boys and girls, right? So obviously, in one way, we haven't been successful, right? But in another way, this thing has been going on for hundreds and thousands of years, so that we kind of have to be aware of what we're up against, and that we have to kind of work on it strategically. But the first thing is, how the law works is that you stop them doing something, right? That's the first thing. So everybody wants to hold them accountable, but I'm just going to give you an example of a few precedences where they were trying to lock us in our homes and say you can't travel. So the law works is that one or two people, or what you probably all did, is go out and not wear a mask and then not end up in prison. And that's actually how you defend and uphold the law. You are establishing a precedence that they don't have jurisdiction or authority over you. And people kind of tend to trivialize that, but this precedence is very important for the next lockdown, that we all just keep traveling, because that undermines them. Even though the people dressed up as police, it is a criminal offence for them to actually spend their day infringing on our inalienable rights, and it is a criminal offence, and they shouldn't be. They're essentially dereliction of their duty, and it is criminal for them. But on the other hand, we do have to work strategically on it, right? Now, the other thing is, people are kind of psyop that the law is difficult, and that everybody goes, oh, I don't know the law. And that is just, when I say a psyop, that's just entirely incorrect. Now, I'm not saying, but this is the whole law, really. This is the law that's been handed down for generations, that we have an obligation to our society, and it's the same everywhere, that we must act in honour and we must do no harm. And the same thing about acting in honour is, you must be honourable in your dealings, which includes fraud, deception, misrepresentation. If you say, I'm going to, repair your kitchen, and you don't do it, that is a fraud in contract law. The same thing as harm. We cannot harm people, but if somebody hits us first, then we have a right to self-defence. And then there is a right to self-defence, which may mean that someone ends up killing someone, but if they have murdered, we'll say, 2 children, and the mother then steps in, and then ends up killing someone, that's where the trial by jury would then assess, was that in self-defense? So the whole law is act in honour, do no harm, and it's quite simple. And when a trial by jury is convened, you don't have to know 500,000 pieces of paper. The 12 men and women assess the evidence and speak directly with the accused, who is innocent until proven guilty. And part of the thing, the trial by jury used to be in Oakwoods and things. So you don't need the court buildings, because people, when you listen to someone, when you are in tune from their answers, all of your senses are heightened on a trial by jury to see if they are actually innocent, So that is the whole law, and then that you have these inalienable rights. And the other thing about a trial by jury, which is very important, is that if you have a trial by jury, and in my case, they are accusing me of a criminal offence. So say if it was the man or woman dressed as police for me, I would then be able to accuse that man, or the so-called woman paid, or the Chief Magistrate of England and Wales, that what the jury would first do would look at the piece of paper, which is the accusation. And the accusation for me was the COVID-19 Act, that says it was a criminal offence to travel to give health information. And if that piece of paper was obviously infringing on my right to travel and speak, but everybody's right to speak, the first thing the trial by jury would do would look at the piece of paper. And if it was infringing on one of your inalienable rights, the trial by jury can nullify the piece of paper. So therefore, the trial by jury is actually higher than all pieces of paper. Yeah? And so if we were to do a precedence, we could always do it on someone that was affected on COVID-19 to prove to them, because ignorance of the law is no excuse. So that if you're paid as the Supreme Court in England, or Ireland, because I've written to them and made them trustees of the invitation, you know, the summons, but they knew, or should have known, that the COVID-19 Act was infringing on all of our rights to travel. Isn't that true? So an ignorance of the law is no excuse, and no one is above the law. So the people that are the most liable are the Attorney Generals, which is a lawful appointment, and the Supreme Court, the 12 men and women, so that you can, you know, challenge the whole precedence around the Chief Justice or the head of the Supreme Court for whether, you know, if somebody writes like Trafalgar Square, if any of you or me, then we can have a trial by jury of 10,000 people in a football stadium and then challenge the issuing of that summons to try and make it a criminal offence. And also they issued warrants for my arrest here. Do you get how simple it is? And that's one of the things why we are so censored, right? Because once you start saying, well, things are actually simple and all you have to do is to establish a trial by jury. Now, I spent last year going to 8 countries and we did an educational trial by jury friend in Oxford. Now, they issued new summonses for me just before that. But then we went on to the Sami people, who are 5 countries, you know, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and they held a trial by jury in their traditional Sami method. And we had myself and 12 people from 12 other countries were observers, and it was exactly the same as we do the trial by jury system in Ireland. It's the same everywhere. So that I think about 1/3 of the population, either of Indigenous and Native people, actually know the trial by jury, or in the Sami people, there is no legal system. They only have the trial by jury system. So a lot of people think it's impossible, but it's actually not that impossible because, and that's why they also are undermining the Native and Indigenous peoples in our nations. Does that make sense? Yeah. So the whole thing then with the precedence is that you have to have standing and then you have to assert their rights, and then it just has to be one man or woman. So I'm just going to give you quick examples. So I know kind of you're all aware of what we were maybe doing in the COVID era, but the example of the Trafalgar Square rallies, where you all, and all the rallies around the country, is what you were doing was actually defending your inalienable rights and in a way giving a couple of fingers to the system, right? So the very fact that all of you met millions of people, that meant that they couldn't lock down the country really, right? So you were establishing a precedence that you have the rights and there was no courts involved. Yeah? So that's actually, and then another example that we have, well, I won't go through, I'll just skip through these, but the World Freedom Alliance were doing it everywhere as well, right? I mean, the people who supported us. But the other thing that we did in 2020 was to set up an airline, Freedom Travel Alliance. Now that we set that up with Susan Sweeten, was an American lady, and what we were doing, so we had about 1,000 people landing in and out of planes on charter flights. And the first flight was from Ghana in Africa into Florida in the middle of the lockdown. And there was one man on that who was very brave. Now, I had offered, and what we did with the people who were on Freedom Travel Alliance is that if they put them in prisons or quarantine hotels, that I was going to swap myself out, you know. So we were flying in and out of Sri Lanka during the coup, in and out of Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and they were letting the flights land, right? Now, what that was doing, and I had said that I would swap myself with them, which means that if you were landing in Australia and they put one of our members who were on the plane into a quarantine hotel, that then I would have a precedence to challenge them, right? Do you get it? About whether it was because partly we got rid of the quarantine hotels in Ireland and mixed dot and people around the world within about 2 weeks in July 2021, because we asked for people in those hotels to ring, and the first lady that phoned me was a Brazilian lady, and she was suicidal. And then what we did was ask somebody from, in the Red Cow Hotel in Dublin, they had the army outside and they were taking people from Dublin Airport under army escort into the hotels. Do you remember that? So then a Brazilian lady phoned me and she really wanted to, you know, she was very upset. So we got the army in, and then I said, I'm recording it. And I just had a phone call with him to say, you cannot detain someone without a lawful conviction. She's not a prisoner. So if you're trying to keep her there without any documentation or process, that is unlawful detention, and that you are liable, and that I'm recording it. And if you don't let her go, that we will have to take a precedence case against you. So you have two choices. You either stay there and we have a precedence case, right? Or you get her bags and you help her leave. So he wouldn't give his name. He said, first of all, he was the head of the army, lieutenant colonel, and then he wouldn't give his name. And then he decided to take her bags. And then we had 28 phone calls in 2 weeks all over the hotels, Britain, London and Canada. And then they all let the people go. And then the 28th guy, he went back to the hotel in Ireland and knocked on the door off his own bat and just emptied 70 rooms in an hour and a half and just said to everybody, you can go. And they all left the Red Cow in one night. And that was, yeah. So that was the end of the quarantine hotels. Yeah. Yes, but the other thing is, and that's part of what the Guardian 300 network did here, and some very brave people did in Canada. Now, and I only have a few slides left, but the reason why that's important is that if they try and lock down again, because for them, they want to establish control, right? So they control it through the legal entity, this legal name, where it's like Mr. Smith or Miss Cahill, and the legal system is actually like a spider's web over the law. It's a private business. So what we have to do is say that they're operating by trying to interact and do business or commerce with the legal entity to invite you into a quarantine hotel, but you have to consent. But if you know that they have no authority to infringe on your rights, then the next time they lock down for climate change or whatever, then everybody just says, as people did, after a while, no, thank you. Do you know, they were actually all in Dublin Airport going, no, thank you. I don't want to stay in your room with your 12 bottles of water or 14 bottles of water and bad food. And I want to go home. And they just went home. So I'll just give two examples in the last two. And then we set up the World PCR Sequencing Consortium. And it was with people like Dr. Jack Lyons-Weiler in America, who has his own institute, and a professor called Professor Shin Lee, who's able to do DNA sequencing. And what we did was we got ethics approval to full-length DNA sequence whatever was in the COVID-19 PCR test. Yeah, whatever it was. And it took us about 3 months in 2021 to get that ethics approval. But that ethics approval is also includes in the law and in their world any future organism or anything, even if it is unknown now, right? So that means we have full ethical approval. And what we were saying is in the interviews and in writing is that the head of the FDA and the CDC would become liable if the PCR test was not COVID-19, whatever that is. So we got ethics approval on a Friday, and then over the weekend in 2021, the FDA and the CDC across America removed all requirements to have a PCR test for working or go to university or travel. Now, the reason why they did that was on the Monday, if you had a builder and he was positive, we had a system of like 50 health hubs across the United States that I would never take one of these tests, but these were people who were volunteering that were taking tests, and that they would take 2 tests. The tests would be videoed. If one came back positive, we would then take the remainder of that and the other one and full-length DNA sequence it. But if that was not COVID-19, right, then it would mean that the whole COVID-19 test was fraudulent, and that the manufacturers would be liable for all fraudulent testing, and that the individual men, the 2 in PCR, or the head of the FDA and CDC, would be liable for replacing the costs of that builder losing his job as a precedence case, so that civil servants are actually liable for what they do. And of course, the head of the FDA and the CDC, when you put it around on civil servants, that actually you hold the responsibility of putting a fraudulent test, because fraud unravels all and you're liable, that then they decided to withdraw the requirement for all PCR testing. And it's the same kind of approach that we would take, right? So that's in a way what we've done up to now. And then I'll just finish off by, in Ireland, we have also written to the Attorney Generals, and we did a lawful trial by jury actually, and you can get the information in Ireland. We actually, with the IRB Supreme Council, which is a historic organisation that was set up in 1858, that in Ireland won an election, proclaimed our nation to be sovereign in 1916, did an election in 1918, 32 counties, and then of course the city of London came in and started killing everybody, you know, after that, and trying to create the trouble in the north. But what we've done, and you can get the information on that website, is we wrote in 2021 to the Queen and the Vatican and the Crown and the City of London, challenging the operation of the private business, which is the legal system in Ireland. And they did write back. And we basically then held a big trial by jury with about 100 people, and it's all videoed and it's on that website, where the trial by jury said the operation of the legal system was criminal and unlawful. And since then, the man who's paid as the Attorney General is now not putting his name to anything, right? Now, what we have to do in Ireland, which we are doing, is setting up a trial by jury system, and we have about 20 conveners, because in a trial by jury system, it is the 12 men and women that actually hold the authority, and they ask the questions, and you're just a convener. But it is that process that we're working on to re-establish, and then we will start holding coroners is one of the key people who falsified death certs. Because there are some examples in Ireland where a coroner, where a young man or, you know, died, we'll say 20-year-old, died immediately after the injection, and on the first death cert was cancer, which he didn't have. The family challenged it, and then it was cardiovascular disease, and then they challenged it again, and then they said COVID-19. Now, what you could do in a precedence is to challenge the first death cert if there was no evidence, and that was a falsification of the death cert, right? Because they hadn't got cancer. And a coroner to falsify a death cert is 5 years in prison. Now, of course, the big thing is, well, you'd also get them to initially rectify the death cert, and then the family could also take them privately and in a private prosecution for falsifying and the harm caused and the misrepresentation. But once the coroners can be held accountable, or here for the midazolam, right? That once coroners do not falsify death certs, then if there is another one, you know, say if they do something with Wi-Fi radiation, or the people, because of the toxicity of their bodies, because of the nanoparticles in people's bodies, if they up the radiation, the 5G, people could start to have nosebleeds that they might say is Ebola, right? Now, if the coroners start writing Ebola, then we have the World PCR Sequencing Consortium, that we can check if it is Ebola, whatever that is, because what they do is they put fragments into the injections that will be positive in subsequent PCR tests, right? But if what we would do would be doing testing beyond their little fragment of whatever the thing is. But then if the coroners could not then put down Ebola or monkeypox or COVID-25, because we can sequence it, but also in a trial by jury, you can challenge the coroner for falsifying the death cert, and that's a public process. And then the coroner can be a precedence in England to be on the trial by jury. Now, I know it's a very long process, but that's the kind of thing we're working at. So I'll finish there, if that's okay, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Great.
Okay, well, ladies and gentlemen, I think on behalf of all of us, without a doubt, we need to thank this woman for her hard and dedicated work. She's certainly a force to be reckoned with. She's put her ass on the line, and we thank you for stepping up. Should we have a standing ovation, everyone?